Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks,
Um,
man.
yeah, so I figure we would kind of get started with just to kind of getting people up to speed on your work over the years that have led up to some of these somewhat tangential moves in different directions that we'll talk more specifically about.
Yeah,
So yeah,
I can
uh,
kick it off a
I
little
want to
bit.
go. Yeah, sounds good.
Um, yeah, I'll kind of give you a brief background. I found photography shortly after spending my high school years um, dealing with stage 4 lymphoma. And, at the time, as a 16, 17, 18-year-old, that doesn't fully register with you. But I guess in my early 20s, I think the heaviness of all that began really setting in. And I went to school the very first semester in college thinking I was going to be a doctor after all that. I thought, man, I've got half of my medical school education already wrapped up in the bag. And I went to a school for pre-med and quickly flunked out within the first semester with a 1.0 and moved back home to Beaumont, Texas. And I needed an elective. And my buddy that I was living with said, "What do you think I ought to take?" He said, "Well, my uncle teaches a photography class. You ought to take that." And then coincidentally, his uncle was this fine art photographer, Keith Carter. And, the very traditional black and white early work of it is what I was seeing at that time. And, it opened me up to a new world, and it gave me the opportunity, I think, with photography to, I knew I wanted to live and learn and explore the world. I didn't have a voice or a means of doing that. And photography opened up that opportunity, with it and given me a tangible way of interpreting my experiences. And so I started out in newspapers, working for a small daily back home near Beaumont called the Orange Leader. I did that for a couple of years, and I used to say it was like a boot camp. I could be at a high school, or like a kindergarten class at 8, a homicide by 12, and a basketball game at 7:30, and
Yeah.
just back in time to like shape my film up and scan it and put it in the system. And when my editor there realized I was really interested in photojournalism, she suggested I go to the University of North Texas up in Denton, Texas, and I did, and that's where I studied international development and photojournalism. And I had this grand notion, I think, like a lot of budding photojournalists, that I want to get this like working knowledge with the international education, international development, so I could inform my practice and go find these exotic stories somewhere on the other side of the planet.
Uh-huh.
And you know, at some point I realized I'm terrible at foreign languages. I tried my hand in Mexico a little bit, and I ended up at some point just deciding I was going to start looking in my own backyard, and that's where I ended up. Uh, Spending from 2009 up until, well, now, in the Mississippi Delta. And I would live with and photograph families in scattered towns across that region, quirky name towns like Bobo or Alligator or Duncan, as well as one of the country's oldest completely African-American communities called Mount Bayou. So that was my life for the past going on 11 years, over 11 years now. And that was a real stylistically, or, in terms of making not just the aesthetic, qualities of working with film and making square pictures. It was just a really big departure from the way I was working as a newspaper photographer, freelancing for the New York Times or Wall Street Journal or something like that. I
Hmm.
suddenly had time and room to breathe, and to really develop relationships with people. It wasn't like an assignment where I just know a paragraph's worth of information on somebody. I go in, I make friends as fast as I can, make them feel comfortable, make myself feel comfortable, get a portrait or a slice of their life, and then move on. This was, that body of work in the Delta was the start of something different for me. And Mike and I were talking about right before this came on that I'm realizing now that over the course of those 10, 11 years, I've essentially been dividing myself between dividing my brain in a way. I'm living a double life where I'm one type of photographer over here and another type of photographer over here. And this summer, during COVID, has been a really big period for me to slow down and assess. You know, work has slowed down dramatically since the beginning of the year, and really, you know, take stock of where I'm at emotionally, where I am with the work I've been producing over the years, the subject matter, my place within that, and what I want the future to be, if there is going to be one. Mike and I thought we would I could show some of this early work in the Delta, and then kind of get you up to speed on where I'm at today, tinkering on some projects in the wild and wonderful world of my living room. Before I just dive into stuff, Mike, do you have some questions or anything?
Well, I think we can just kind of chat through as we're looking, but so you can go ahead and start the screen share if you want. But
okay.
One thing that I just find particularly compelling about the work in the Delta, and you know, Brandon and I basically kind of before doing this decided we weren't going to make focus too much of our conversation on this work or some of the complex feelings around this work right now, having to do with, you know, representation and things like that. There's a lot of this type of work is being really interrogated right now, but I just want to say that, like, you know, we're not going to jump too much into that conversation because we're two white guys and it doesn't really make sense for us to try to hash that out right now. But I want to say that I just see this work as absolutely connected and bridge building work. And one thing that happens, actually go back a slide. One of the, I think the most powerful things that happens in this body of work is this man that you're seeing on the right here. And Brandon, you can talk more about this, but like, this is this soft, tender image. And this comes, you know, I don't know, 4 or 5 years in, maybe later. And in the very beginning of the project, we see in the book a portrait of this same guy, and it's such a different portrait. And that to me is like the thing that happens when you really invest yourself in a place and the community, and you can kind of see in that it is a collaborative and a just a really give and take relationship instead of just a kind of extractive relationship, which is often, you know, the criticism that comes with being an outsider and going into a community.
I had gotten a copy of the Aperture's Vision and Justice issue that was guest curated by Sarah Lewis 2 years ago, maybe. And the whole issue was predominantly focused upon, it was predominantly focused on the portrayal of Black American photography. And there was this quote, you hinted at it a second ago, that reminded me of it. She said, art is often the way to cross the gulf that separates us. How we remain connected depends on the function of pictures. Increasingly, the way that we process worlds unlike our own. And I mean, for me, that's what this body of work was. It was, you know, this yearning to understand, you know, the world that I'm born into, the world that I reside in, and then this other world that I was allowed into, you know. So it was, you know, you said bridge earlier, but I like to think this was an attempt to cross a bridge, to seek truths and in and of themselves, you know. The images I'm showing here are like, I did a really interesting thing. So throughout the past 11 years, I was photographing things like this, you know, and eventually the idea came about that we would make a book. And it's my first book. We published it in 2017. But all the while during that period of time, I was photographing, people would call and say, hey, Brennan, you're in town. It's like, yeah. And they're like, hey, my grandmother's in from Chicago. Will you come take our photograph on Sunday? Or we just had a new baby. Would you come by and take a picture of the family? Or, hey, I got a new lady friend. Why don't you take our picture? And so all the while I was photographing this whole other set of images that I never showed other than to the people that requested them, or they sat in my archive and they were just outtakes of things that didn't fall within the book visually. And 2 years ago, my friend Choo Choo here, his son got on the phone with me and said that Choo Choo had passed away. And Choo Choo was one of a man that I would see routinely for the weeks that I would be there. And when he told me that, I immediately went to the closet and began filing all of the negatives I could find of his father. And we made some big prints. They put them in the funeral brochure. And for me, it was this magnificent and powerful moment where I believed that it was the most powerful thing I'd ever done in photography. And I've said this before, that it was a contribution to a son's lasting memory of his father, and that in and of itself is this idea that I'd like to convey with the type of work that I've made there and strive to make on other projects, is that, for me, photography has always been about building relationships and telling stories, and sharing those stories with one another. And this common goal of understanding. I've always, I guess I always believe that you can't really know, you can only know someone as much as they're willing to allow you, And fortunately, over the past decade, I've had this really beautiful opportunity to, watch families grow, children. Like a miracle here, she was one of the youngest little babies in the Coffee family when I first went to the Delta. And this is her as an infant on the right, and this is her several years later up to my stomach, my chest. And so, that in and of itself, being able to see, babies go from this big to this big to this big, and suddenly they got sass and they're kicking boys down the street, is a wondrous thing. So I wanted to share some of this work that I haven't really shown. I just, over the summer when things were slow, I thought I'm going to start putting this work on my website at least. And these are the pictures that when I would go to, say, Reverend Hall's house here on the left, I would stay with Reverend Hall in Mound Bayou when I'd come to Mound Bayou. And he'd put me up in the spare room. We'd play chess every day. I think I only won one game in 10 years. But we would sit and just talk about the world and spiritual affairs and woes and what have you over chess every day, 2 or 3 times a day. But these are the pictures that I would find posted above his bedside table, or in the living room, or Tiffany, this is a miracle, and her sister Mama, during their birthday party. We had a joint birthday party. We had a Frozen themed birthday cake, and we all have birthdays in the same week in March. But, Tiffany, their mom, she would take the prints that I would bring and wrap them up in tissue paper and put them in the closet so the cigarette smoke wouldn't damage them. And to be able to see a grandmother from the Coffee family, looking through pictures with a miracle or one of her cousins at essentially their baby pictures, it was really humbling, So that's what this other batch of photographs is I've been compiling silently.
I want to ask about something I've been curious about for a while, which is, I understand somewhat the basis of where the title "In That Land of Perfect Day" comes from, and and there's so much spirituality, not only literally in the images in churches and things like that, but just there feels like a lot of just playing with light and glowing and things that kind of feel ethereal or spiritual. I'm wondering kind of what role spirituality plays in the project, and as far as the connection you mentioned with the Reverend, kind of connecting over spirituality. Could you speak to that a little more?
Yeah, it's wrapped up in every strand of it. Um,
Yeah.
so normally if I give a talk, I introduce the project in a certain way. And um, I, maybe a year or so into my first few visits in the Delta, I was up late. I used to have this belief that if I stayed up and did work at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, I could get more done because everybody else was asleep, and I'd have more energy to burn. But I was listening to this YouTube copy of a sermon of Dr. Martin Luther King that he delivered in '67, the fall before his assassination. And he was speaking to the story about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were cast into the king's fire, King Nebuchadnezzar's fiery furnace, and refusing to bow to the king's golden idol. And it said that when the king's men peered into the chamber, that they saw four figures standing amongst the flames. The fourth being presumably their Lord shepherding them from the heat. But Dr. King used that example as an example of the earliest recorded version of civil disobedience, and that was his message during that sermon, was focusing on civil disobedience. And he had this quote that I kept that it said, "Somewhere along the way, you should discover something that is so dear, so precious to you, something that is so eternally worthful that you could never give it up. You want to discover some principle. You ought to have some great faith that grips you so much that you can never give it up. Somehow you must go on and say, I know that the Lord that I worship is able to deliver me. But if not," which is the title of the sermon, "I'm going on anyhow. I'm going to stand up for it anyway." And so when you ask about faith, the two themes that he talks about, faith and perseverance, run the full gamut of the experience and throughout the body of work itself. You mentioned the title. I was, when trying to conjure up how this book would be made, I realized that those two themes ran throughout the book or throughout my time there, and that could be an uncle with his infant twin nephews. That could be the story of Tiffany taking care of her babies. That could be echoed in the songs we would sing in church, like "This Little Light of Mine" or "By and By" or "Take My Hand, Precious Lord," which was sang at Dr. King's funeral. But the original title of the body of work was called "When Morning Comes." This whole idea that if today is not the day, tomorrow is always promised to be, right? And if tomorrow's not the day, it's coming. You have faith and you push for, you believe in something, and you believe in something bigger than yourself, and you push for it and you sacrifice yourself if that's what it comes down to. So when I changed the title for the actual book, it was called "In That Land of Perfect Day." And it came from the same hymn that "When Morning Comes" derived from, called "By and By." It says, "We are often tossed and driven on the restless sea of time. Somber skies and howling tempests oft succeed a bright sunshine. In that land of perfect day, when the mists have rolled away, we will understand it better by and by." The original title came from "By and by, when the morning comes, when the saints of God are gathering home, we will tell the story how we've overcome. We will understand it better by and by." So religion's in and out of it, and all around it. Yeah. Yeah. I'll go through some of these right quick. Once I started digging through the archive, I realized I had tons of, babies. My buddy Nut and his grandson. This guy on the right was the son of my friend Gigi. They just had a baby. Holding two babies, holding family, holding animals, holding a turtle.
Wow.
That's Nut. I used to carry around 3x3-inch square prints in my pocket if I went somewhere I'd never been to. And I went into this bar once in town in Duncan, and somebody was like, "What are you doing here?" And I was like, "This." And the guy started flipping through, and he's like, wait, that's my cousin. That's his first beer. You took that picture? It's in his house. I said, yeah, that's me. Or somebody will be like, that's my uncle. And so I always kept these little pictures around, you know, and that was invaluable, you know. There's, yeah, a lot of little stories like that. But this is my friend Herman, Lank on the left, Lank right on the left, and Tiffany. They're from the Coffee family. And then Lank's best friend since childhood is Herman on the right, and he's married to Lank's sister, Nee. His friends and cousins. This is Dang Dang, Damien, and his lady when she was pregnant. So there's all this, you know, all this kind of work that I haven't really come to terms with in terms of, you know, for me, it was when the coffees, the couple years, the coffees, by the way, are the nucleus of all the relations that I had in the Delta. The first man that Mike mentioned was James Watson Jr. We called him Dance Machine. He was sleeping at the coffee's house and invited me over. I thought I was going to his house, and come to find out he was staying with Mr. Van. And a couple years prior to that, Mr. Van's, the grandfather of the house, his house had burned down, and they had lost nearly everything but his guns and some coins, which also included their family album. And so a lot of this over the years was an attempt to restock, you know, a family album. And that's kind of what this body of work that I haven't really done anything with is meant to be. You know, yeah. I put it on the website as an exercise or a celebration. And I'm not sure if it's meant to be anything more than just a family album.
Well, the use of that word celebration, I want to actually talk about that, because I think that's another thing that is central to what I appreciate about your work. And it's something that I'm kind of like trying to lean into more in my practice as well, is that I feel like in both journalism and documentary tradition, and in separately in kind of like the world of fine art, there's, you know, in documentary work, it's like if it's not serious, if it's not issue related and heavy, then it's not like meant to be taken seriously. And in the art world, it's like if it's sentimental, then that's like a curse word in art. So I love the idea of just celebrating life, love, whatever it is that you're drawn to, beauty, and it not having to be more than that. Just being okay with taking pictures of things that make you happy or whatever, without, you know, being worried about that making it feel cheap or anything like that.
Sure. You know, it's something that particularly now that I'm doing these still lives, I guess it's been an exercise for me to actually slow and find a new rhythm. Like I said, I feel like so much of my work professionally or in terms of these personal projects, I've always relied upon, you know, relating to someone else and getting to know someone else. And now with COVID, you know, that opportunity is not always present. And so, you know, this summer, I think, you know, the summer's been a really rough one for me emotionally. And it's had me really go back and look through a lot of this early work and try to assess, like, what is its relevance now? You know, what was I ever, you know, the author that, you know, that needed to do this? What's my position in that? Where, you know, and really go through a whole, you know, sit down, the things that I did at the very beginning of the first couple of years of the project, sit back down and really assess, you know, through a new lens in a way, you know, of what this work means to me, to others, and most importantly, to the families that are in it, you know. And so within that, and just with work slowing down assignment wise, I've had a lot of time at home, and I think it's the devil's workshop with idle hands, and just started, you know, building things to try to keep myself busybody. But you're right. I mean, and that's a big shift for me. You know, I started working in Southern Louisiana at the beginning of this year. I had a super heavy broken heart a couple years ago, and I'd always known about this poem, Evangeline. It's a Wadsworth Longfellow poem that he wrote about two Acadian lovers that were separated by the in Nova Scotia by the British invasion. And the story has it that Evangeline wandered what would be now the continental U.S., the eastern part and southern part, looking for, her beloved, and doesn't end up finding him. She's always right on his heels the whole way. Doesn't end up reuniting with him until literally, minutes before his death. And so the idea of like, I'm at a point now where I've started on this new body of work that uses that poem loosely at this point as a sort of visual foundation or a way to, kind of percolate ideas. Still really doing a lot of the stuff I was doing in Mississippi in terms of, I would just ride my bike from village to village or township, Delta. And, so I'm setting out to still do a lot of that methodology in Louisiana, but there's this departure. And now that I'm not focused solely upon the documentation of something, now I have this freedom to create. And like you said, the sort of stopping at the sentimental or the beautiful or just the thing that gives you pause. As I think it's become a new window or a new outlet for me creatively, that relies solely upon me and the extent of my creativity, which can oftentimes be, I think, your biggest nemesis. But I'm right there with you.
So what made you feel like you wanted to start creating work that was more proactive instead of reactive, and shifting into creating?
I guess it's a couple things. I mean, one was that the Mississippi book had been published a couple years before this. And quite honestly, like when the book was published, I solely focused on trying to do my assignments and pay debts, pay bills, and maybe get ahead if I could every now and then. But in the meantime, I had never really come up with a sort of back burner project. Something else. I was tinkering on chasing raccoon hunters and things like that over time, but never really took that all the way. And, instead of trying to climb a new mountain that like an Everest, I felt like I needed to start creating little short stories instead of making a novel, make some things that are somewhat quick, that might push a few buttons in me internally and maybe help me look inward, after a turbulent time. And I think there's a lot of freedom in that idea, like you just said, like creating instead of taking,
Totally. I feel like I really resonate with that right now too. Just kind of like things that feel, it feels less daunting to start something when you're not committing to like, oh, this is going to be this huge thing. You can just kind of do it until you feel like you don't want to do that anymore. And and just as someone who's seeing that project develop from the outside, it did feel like, I mean, I don't know how long you worked on it before you started to share any of that work, but it felt like all of a sudden there was just this like body of work there, and it's just all these images. I was like, wow, that just happened.
That was literally the first week of January. I called a girlfriend of mine in Dallas and asked her if she would come and model for me and just take a drive. And so this Evangeline work, what I have so far is in total 4 days worth of shooting.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then I shook the canisters and developed it as fast as I could. I had the lab in Dallas develop that batch, Photographique. They're a great family-owned lab in Dallas. But so I like scanned it as fast as I could within a week of shooting it and put it up on site. I was so excited to have something new.
Let's take a look at some of that.
Okay. Everybody see that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is just the tightest little edit possible, but trying to play with feelings of loss or wonder, it worked out that week we had every single day was foggy, and particularly once you're along the river, things will have a tendency to be foggy. So fortunately that front came in and it lended a nice stage for us.
Yeah.
And this was also the first time I think I had done a lot of, maybe this is appropriate for right now, even more so, but I did a lot of the scouting. I knew there were 4 places that I had in my mind that I wanted to go to. And within that, just from looking on Instagram or Pinterest on travel, like I go to these like junky travel pages on Pinterest, and I'll see somebody's photograph and say, where was that taken? And it'll put me on a travel site. And then next thing you know, I've got like the national park website pulled up. But I did a lot of scouting, but it's like stupid enough with Google Street View. Like if I knew there was a region I wanted to go to, I'd just zoom over there with my virtual car and check it out and do the 360 and then pop my little man back out. But so there were a couple places that like the cemetery on the right that I'd been to in the past that I knew I wanted to go to. But then like this nature walk on the left, Google Street View could only give me so much of a view down that trail. Yeah.
So was any of this like narrative structure pre-existing, or like did you like storyboard out like I want these images, or was it just kind of
whatever, like what you see is what you get?
Yeah.
No, I mean, other than locations, I didn't have any preconceived notion of what was going to happen. And that was, I mean, I didn't want to read and like thoroughly digest the poem itself until after I'd like stuck a claim photographically. So literally I didn't read the full. It had been years and years and years since I'd read the full poem. And I didn't want to taint that. I think there's a fine line. I've had some talks about this with friends in the past. Like, I think it's a tightrope to use literature as a source, like to try to illustrate a poem. There's a way to do it and do it really well, and there's a way to do it horribly, and that's what I was trying to stay away from, just regurgitating imagery, and in the end, who knows, a year from now I might strip the whole poem idea out of the project and turn it into something else. And it's just the nature of personal projects. You're not at the behest of anyone else.
That's a very liberating thought to think that you can just change what a project is about in some ways. As your own thinking evolves.
Well, that's like the development of the book. Initially, when I first met Reverend Hall and he invited me to stay with him and introduced me to his congregation, and I thought, well, this is what an unbelievable story. It's a story that I was never taught in school. This historic tale of the founding of this completely African-American town founded by freedmen in 1887. Freedmen who came from the very heart of the Confederacy, the Davis Plantation, and set out and carved their own enclave in the heart of one of the harshest places in the country for an African-American family to reside. And there by 1910, the New York Times is coming down and writing articles about the prosperity and the achievement they had. President Theodore Roosevelt's waving his hand from the back of a train. It was this miraculous story of achievement and triumph by people that had overcome so much. And I thought that like the photojournalist, that was 2009, 10, when, it was into 2009 when I found out about Mount Bayou. And I thought, oh man, that's the story. That is the story. And for all my attempts that all failed dismally, you know, I was trying to cram a body of work into this very narrow spectrum. And all the while, all the relationships I had outside of that one town were blossoming and bringing forth fruit. But under the, you know, the horse blinders of trying to create like a concrete narrative, I was negating all of that, right? So it wasn't until I like took the square peg, jammed in the round hole out, you know, that I finally freed up and I could see the work I was making as a whole, you know, and go into portfolio reviews, and I would cut out those 3x3 inch squares. Instead of showing these big 16x20 prints at a portfolio review, early on, I would lay out all of these tiny prints. And people like Stacy Clarkson, who was at Harper's, or Elizabeth Biondi at the New Yorker, unbeknownst to me, was then speaking, you know, their language as an editor who's used to like sifting through the madness of a you know, a mountain of images and finding a rhythm. And that's when I was introduced to what I was tinkering with visually, you know, seeing how images related to one another, you know, playing with diptychs. Do these two work, you know, or do they negate one another? And so by 2010, that's really when I understood that, you know, like there really is something here, and I need to pull back and breathe for a moment and just let the world provide what it's going to provide.
And do you think it took unlearning any, was there a particular indoctrination that you felt like you had to unlearn to get to a place where you could think of narrative more loosely and not so rigidly defined?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, you know, the early upbringing of photojournalism, I think all of those things, all of the components of telling a visual, like a photographic story, are within all of my bodies of work. In terms of, and that's what I teach the high school students I teach is, you know, you get a portrait, you know, get an environment, and remember that the environment can be just as important a character as the portrait, you know, get some details and some motion, or, you know, some scene setter. And those elements that I'd picked up from working as a newspaper photographer, all like at least created the framework. Where the big hurdle was trying to create more of an elliptical narrative or some sort of open-ended narrative than, you know, relying upon a linear narrative that's like, we start here, we get here, there's some resolution, and it's over, you know? And so that was mentally, in trying to compile images, that was a hard thing to break. But yeah. And
do you feel like there is now an underlying structure that you use to edit, or is it more just like an intuitive, free-flowing process?
I think initially, maybe it's constant. Initially, it becomes pretty free-flowing, you know. I might cluster things like in groups of, oh, let me assess where all my portraits are, let me get all my details organized, and let me get all my environments organized, and then see which one's going to be the you know, the opener, and which ones pair together well, and which ones can be really good antagonists for the other, and sort of, you know, bob and weave until I find 2, 3, 4, you know, 6, and then find another 6 to go with them. And a lot of times, funny enough, I've noticed that when I edit things, I'll put them in a sequence, and when I get done, I realize that I've sequenced them where, like, almost completely backwards, where the ender that I've picked should actually be my beginning, and so on, all the way back across.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And so that's something I play with. And that's, you know, like, that's the big departure too in shooting film like this and these squares. I shoot with a Mamiya C330, the twin lens. And, you know, it's a very slow and paced rhythmic camera. And it, not just in the mechanics of it, but then also the idea of shooting film, and you have a finite amount, and you got, you know, you really start to pay attention to what you're doing and being cognizant of that. And it started opening me up to a new type of image making, where I was making images with a lot more intent. Whereas I feel like even to this day, and probably more, you know, more so with my digital work that I'll do on assignment, it's, I don't know if you'd say more intuitive, but I find that I get in a rhythm, a system where I'm doing the exact same thing, and it's a hard thing to break, of shooting the exact, I could have 4 different portrait assignments in 4 months, and they all end up kind of looking very similar in their methodology.
Yeah.
And this was a huge departure from that. But at the same time, what I noticed, my 35 millimeter, when I started shooting squares in Mississippi, all of my 35s became less and less layered and more dead weight centered images, and more like far more simplistic, you know?
Yeah.
And
Interesting.
yeah, it really is. And trying, you know, and maybe that's a good thing, because I could put 35 millimeter work alongside square work, and maybe they'll kind of look similar. In some assignments I get, we do that, and it works out. But also, like, try to remind myself on stray assignments where I'll be like, crank it up to F16 and just like run wild with the layers and see what you can do, and like get your third eye going, you know? So
Yeah. So has that been, you know, you started, I don't know exactly when you started with that camera. When I met you, you had the C330 around your neck. Has that been the same camera all these years?
it is technically not the same camera. It's the second body. The first body, like in 2012 or 13, about 4 or 5 years after I had it, the advancing mechanism, the mechanism inside that keeps you from being able to wind the whole roll, you know, that stops you at each frame, failed. And I like put a roll in, and it started winding. I was like, why the hell isn't this thing catching? And I ran through a whole roll. And I get all these on Craigslist, like locally, when I was in Dallas. You know, so I've got a body now that I've been using since 2013. But yeah, I think you and I met maybe at Look 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that would have been early. That would have been 2000. I first ventured to the Delta on my way home from Look 3 in June 2009. Me and our buddy Blake Gordon, I dropped him at the bus station in Nashville, and then I went on my way. But yeah,
cool.
So yeah, I guess I've known you since the beginning.
Yeah.
Change your life.
So as we move into talking about this new body of work, the still life stuff, I've been thinking a little bit about that. You know, with the 6 Feet Project, we've seen so many people, so many different ways that people have reacted to this time. And so much of it is just like out of a necessity, like, you know, how can I make work if I can't go out into the world and shoot in the way that I normally do? And it's so interesting how it stretches people in different ways to think about new ways of seeing, new ways of trying to explore this creativity while we're all closed in and not able to be as busy as we normally are, or interact with people in the same ways.
Sure.
So yeah, this we've seen, you know, of course we've seen some still life work over the process of this project, but you know, seeing your work really made me think about how appropriate of a medium that is for this time of just being still and taking the time to really, you know, explore yourself and and, you know, your own internal landscape. So a fun little thought exercise that I just thought of earlier was thinking of it in terms of this time as in terms of punctuation and you know, kind of going back to your using literary inspiration and you know, because it's obviously, it feels like a pause, but punctuation also sometimes notes what comes next. You know, is it a end of a thought and then you continue another thought, or is it a comma and then it's just like you're going to continue on with what you were doing before with a slight pause in between, or is it question mark, because who the fuck knows? You know, do any of those feel like, what do you think this time is for you in terms of punctuation?
God, I would say a semicolon, but I've never really understood how to use
Yeah, I
it.
don't know what those are.
I don't know. I honestly, it's a question mark. It's in all intents and purposes a question mark, and I think it's a crossroads in so many ways. You know, for me, you know, if we start from one end, you know, with the work that I've done in the past, you know, it's like I said earlier, a period of assessment and reevaluation and becoming, you know, a much better listener in all sense of the word. You know, and it's been a time for me to say, like, do I need to put this work like away, you know, and just move on, you know? And the thing about that is it's the relationships that all that work came from. That in essence would be me, you know, stepping back from those relationships that I can't not do, you know. There's so much emotionally tied up in that, but it's been this weird quandary where I feel like I'm really, you know, struggling with what it all means. And so there's a question mark there. Professionally, you know, make no mistake, like all of this personal work is not my bread-winning source. And my assignment work, the stuff that nobody really ever sees, that I don't ever really, you know, show, all of that has drastically dropped, like many editorial photographers in the past, you know, 6 months, 4 months. And there's, I feel like I'm at this question mark again of, is this really the occupation that I want to keep doing? You know, like, does the stress of the instability that I've lived with for the past 15 years, is that truly where is that truly where I need to be? You know, am I capable of finding another source of revenue that also allows me to continue my personal work, the stuff that has no deadlines, the stuff that has no demands? And, you know, so I'm questioning that, or do I reinvent myself professionally and get out of editorial altogether and start focusing on, we talked about this earlier, more commercial work? Like, is there a way to take the aesthetic of my personal work and harness that aesthetic approach toward building portfolios of commercially viable product? You know, like more black and white portraits of models, or, you know, fashion geared stuff, or more art, you know, like a photograph, this wonderful soul, Adia Victoria. She's a Nashville musician. And I had a shoot for her for Fader magazine. She had came through Dallas, and I shot some film portraits of her, and I did some 35 digital of her show. And we just got along really, really well. And about 3 months later, I got an email from Atlantic Records. She had signed with the record label, and they said, "Hey, Adia wants you to be the guy that shoots her promotional materials for her upcoming album we're going to release." And I thought, holy shit, like, this is happening. Like, maybe I truly have bridged the divide between my personal vision and my, you know, and my working vision. And we did a bunch of in-studio portraits on my C330. It's flawless. It looked wonderful. And then I never really did any more of that type of work. And so now I've been tinkering around with that notion of where that road could lead, you know. Yeah, because I think, you know, after 15 years of freelancing, I know there's a lot of people with the ups and downs of the editorial world, where there's a lot of editors I know that just got out. They took a buyout, and now maybe they freelance, you know, edit every now and then. Or they move on to organizations that don't require the type of photography I make, you know. Or new editors come in, like we were talking about, and they have their art school friends that are now freelancing, and they hire them, or somebody they know from the new, you know, just a new batch of creatives come out. At some point, I feel like a tidal wave comes, and you either sink or swim or move your boat over a little bit. So yeah, so I'd say a big question mark in every respect of the way.
Yeah.
I think there's also, you might be able to talk about this too as a freelancer. I think this time has really forced me to look at how closely I have allowed my productivity, my creative productivity, and my momentum and the professional, like in my signing world, my shooting world, with my mental well-being. I was telling Andrew Fednick that the other night. He's in here. Hey, Andrew. That it's a really dangerous gamut that you run when you're, you know, a working creative, where your whole existence relies upon you pushing yourself, you know, and
Yeah.
you can be your own worst enemy. But there's a certain stress that comes with that that now I'm recognizing how much of a folly that can be. And
Yeah.
you know, and you've got to find that little well of happiness within yourself, you know, and that can go toward relationships. You know, some people get married because they need the support of the other person, or what have you. It's just something I've never really wanted to acknowledge. So I think this time has been a time of reckoning for that too, which is where a lot of the still life stuff comes in.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's take a look at some of that. Yeah, I would say for me, it's to speak to what you were just saying about putting that pressure on yourself to stay kind of like, I don't know, active and working. In the last couple of years, I've had a strange and somewhat opposite thing where I've just developed other interests and focuses that are completely unrelated to photography, or at least they seemed unrelated, but I'm starting to find the connections between them.
Yeah.
Like for example, I took about a year and just built a house. I took every single day of that year, except for one commission that was like an ongoing thing that I worked on, and I worked on that house all day, every day, and it was the most intensely I've ever focused on anything. I never focused on any photo project for anywhere near that that extent of time.
Yeah.
And so
accomplished at the end of the day.
Yeah, it felt really good, but at the end of it, like I didn't really. I felt like I wanted to be done with that because I had done that for like a year, but I didn't necessarily feel like jumping right back into that same kind of energy with photography either.
Sure.
I just felt like I had needed just some time to like not do much, and I've been in that period for another. It's been a year now. I finished it almost exactly a year ago, the house.
Wow.
So now I've been kind of in this like hangover from that, and just now feeling like I'm ready to start going after things again, whether that be building or photography or whatever it ends up being. And I did end up kind of finding that the building and the photography were very closely related, because the house that I built was a conceptual art piece in some ways, and it used a lot of the stories that I had been photographing over the years. Those stories are told through the house as well.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a liberating way for me to kind of realize it doesn't have to be photography. It can be other things.
For sure. And that's a hell of an accomplishment in and of itself. That's amazing.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's got to feel really rewarding. When my wife and I lived in Dallas, we moved, and I had a grandfather die a couple summers ago, and my mom had to move home to take care of my grandmother with dementia. And my wife and I moved to Houston to take care of her house here. And but before we left Dallas, I had, for the first time, I had a yard that, for better or worse, I had every weekend was like mowing grass and weed eating. And
Yeah.
you know, like I couldn't have had an assignment for an entire week, but I'd be damned if my yard didn't look immaculate, and I'd feel so great at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And that can be dangerous too. But yeah, there's something about having an outlet. I forget if it was, I'll paraphrase it and butcher it, but I think it was Robert Frank that I believe that said every photographer should have this other thing in their life, you know, that they harness from. Yeah. Do you read a lot?
Not really. More audiobooks. Well, I guess that counts too, but yeah. I always have like a couple books that I'm picking away at.
Yeah. I started listening to Eckhart Tolle. I think that's how you say his last name. Audio book. I fall asleep to that. But I've been treating books. I don't know if it's just the stress of the summer, but I've been treating books like TV channels. You know, like I'll get into the first chapter or two, and then the concentration is just shot. And so I'll go
Yeah.
pick up something else that entertains me for a little while.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is kind of like these new photography projects. Unfortunately, these still lives have been, you know, something to hold me. I recently like started developing my own film at home for the first time. Now that my Uncle Scrooge's big money vault is about dried up, I had to stop taking my film to the developer, and it has been the best thing I could. I don't know why I haven't done it sooner, because I feel like I just quadrupled the amount of shooting I do now. Just because I don't have the extra overhead of bringing it to the developer, shop, and I don't have to wait that extra 48 hours to get the film back, or week, or whatever it is. And so that's pushed me. Like my wife and I last weekend went and got all kinds of props, i.e. plants, and started shooting stuff all weekend. I think I shot like 25 or 30 rolls in 3 days, and it was awesome. But so this is the kind of stuff I've been tinkering on. This is the very first batch I did at my mother-in-law's house in the barn in Mississippi over the summer. Just, playing with depth of field and the little nuances of things. We'd go on walks, and I'd clip little bits and pieces of plants I'd found along the way and shoot them. My mother-in-law had a bunch of sunflowers in the harvest this year, so I tried one of those. But a lot of these, I'm starting to, like, let me pause for a second to say, like, a lot of this stuff is great. I really like it. But I'm beginning to realize now, after doing some of this, that I kind of feel like I've got to go to another level, and whether that includes layering, like I've got an approach down. I can properly light something. I can play with shadows and fills. But I'm still just shooting that one object, and making the lighting the creative aspect of it. And so that's sort of the next step for me, is to start layering things and dealing less in the finite and the concrete and the direct, here's a plant, and trying to deal more with metaphors, and allegories. So this one, my grandfather, I'd put this on Instagram. My grandfather collected, unbeknownst to me, until about a year or two before his death, collected 4-leaf clovers. And he had taught me that, and if you find a 4-leaf clover, if you mark it with a little stick, and you go back, you will always find another 4-leaf clover in that spot. They grow as they're independent on plant. And so anyway, one day he comes into the kitchen, and he's got this Reader's Digest, giant, thick encyclopedia-looking book called the Book of the Garden, and just awesome illustrations throughout that book. It's a wonderful book. He wouldn't give it to me. I had to buy my own copy. But he takes that book and he opens the cover and just starts shaking it upon the kitchen table, and all of these 4-leaf clovers start falling out that he kept for 30 years. And he gave them to me in a little Avon jewelry box, or Avon makeup box. And so in that attempt to try to come up with things that weren't so direct, I thought I would start tinkering on objects like this, used a magnifying glass to kind of separate it a bit. We took a little bit of paper, and I learned this from a friend, Elliot Dudek. He shot Civil War reenactors, and he built this platform or a cart that he would lay the reenactor on top of to give just like a 2-foot separation from the grass that they were in, the field that they were in. But it was just enough to give them the sense that they were floating visually. Yeah. And so I was trying to figure out how to get rid of the flatness of having all of these 4-leaf clovers laying on top of one another. And I got some of the film box that I had, the Tri-X box, and tore it up and made a little circle and lifted that first one up to give it some depth. But
Mm.
that's the fun stuff about this is I used to, when I was trying to make money in college at the University of North Texas, during the summers, I would assist the fashion photographers at JCPenney's corporate would do, on figure stuff in the studio, or most of the time I was assisting the still life photographers that were shooting shoes and underwear and jewelry and making fake, bedroom sets. And I realized, particularly now that I'm tinkering with this, it brought me back then to, you almost felt like you were like you were stoned, because suddenly you're like trying to problem solve all these things. Like, how do I get more light inside that shoe? Let me get some foil and ball it up and roll it in there. That'll do it. Or, there's all these little problem solving things. And that's really what this has been about, is how can I spice it up a little bit, or, tweak this or that.
So it sounds like, as a meditative process, it's kind of less about what the objects are and more about the process of seeing them and arranging them and kind of being playful with how you're interacting with them.
Yeah,
right?
very much so. I mean, I think at this early stage, yeah. And if I could take it to another level where I'm actually trying to say something, beyond just celebrating the object itself, I think I could really grow pretty content, So things like this. I bake pies, and my favorite pie is a pear ginger pie that I make.
Oh, sounds
And
good.
I use these Bosc pears, so I've got 2 of them here. And I got on, like animals is a big thing. And the man I studied under, Keith Carter, he would utilize animals a lot in his work. And, animals hold so much meaning and can allude to so much throughout our history. And I was like, where the hell am I going to get a blackbird or a raven? Where do you get that? You go to Amazon.com and you can have prime shipping of a fake life-size raven for Halloween. And so that's what I did, and I got some pears and tinkered around. But so just tinkering like this, My wife and I I'm really excited about this. I felt like Kate Brecky last night. We were taking a walk, and I found a dead bird on the road that was must have died like an hour before. It was in perfect condition. I put it in the dog cart, and it's now in double Ziploc bags in my freezer. I'm going to try to do something with it. I don't know yet, but yeah. So anyway,
Won't have to rely on Amazon anymore. You can supply your own birds.
Relying on the Lord.
So I want to encourage anyone on who has any questions. Now would be a great time to type those in, or we can call on you or whatever. We're kind of getting to a point of wrapping up, but love to hear from any of you that have any questions. So do you think the still life practice is something that is just like born out of necessity and maybe meaningful for this time, but that you wouldn't necessarily want to continue? Or does it feel like you've actually tapped into something that you'd like to continue to develop even when you don't really feel like you need to anymore?
I think over time now that I've gotten myself used to the idea, especially now that there's that personal challenge of trying to elevate it to another degree. I think it's something I'll always tinker with. Because it's something I can do on a Saturday. I don't have to go anywhere, I just have to be where I'm at. And my little $30 Amazon purchase of a backdrop setup, like the stands, the cross beam, and some sandbags you have to fill yourself. It's $30. Came to the house, and so they got me set up. I was super excited about it, and so that's what I'm doing. Yeah, I think it's important for all of us to have a couple things that we tinker on. Yeah. Oh, your lighting is beautiful. Is it natural light in the stores? Yeah, I saw one of the questions. And I don't ever use artificial light except for like maybe a stray assignment for a newspaper or something. Very rarely. Yeah. And that's, and that's something else is like, I think, especially in the working world, we went through a spell where all you would see in the glossy magazines were these high production images. It's like 3 assistants and you shoot this portrait of somebody. And it's always really daunting to me, like equipment and artificial lighting is just one more gadget to get in between me and the person I'm trying to photograph.
Sure. Yeah.
Like some friends walk around and they've got a Q flash and, flashing a scene. I would be so self-conscious. But other people can do it wonderfully,
Yeah.
and really own it. I couldn't, but.
Yeah. I mean, I think it depends for me, but absolutely if intimacy is the goal, then, like when one of the last times we talked a couple of years, or I guess it's been like 4 years ago now, I was traveling through the Mississippi Delta area, and I called Brandon just to kind of like, be like, hey, I'm in the area that you spent a lot of time. Do you have any like advice? At that point, I was working on a project called States of Fear, which is a series of portraits that like very intimate, and it was more about the conversation than the portrait, but the portrait really needed to carry the weight of the emotion of the statements that were being made. And that work, I absolutely felt like I couldn't have lit that there was just kind of no question it had to be natural light. Whereas on assignment work, generally, like I probably I light more than I don't.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's kind of the line, is like how much do I need to really feel engaged and have a moment with a person versus creating an effect or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, it was always a challenge for me, and I've recognized that it's not always perfect, for getting the shot you need, but trying to go on an assignment and negotiate the quagmire of dealing only with natural light, and making a successful portrait. Mm-hmm. I think it's a challenge that I love. It's a problem. It's a puzzle. But then sometimes, when I'm on assignment, like you said, I realize how much easier it is to just, if you can light really well with artificial light, it can look natural,
Yeah.
And that's something I try to tinker with is,
Same here.
Yeah.
We have a couple just comments in here from Barbara Dombach. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Brandon, your images are moving. The human involvement is so inspiring and emotionally captivating, and your still life are simple yet thoughtfully executed and moving as well. From Jane, thank you so much for the wonderful conversation. Very insightful to your beautiful work. And well, Susan asked if she could join in real quick and say a comment. Do you want to go ahead and do that, Susan?
Yeah, I was just, I was really been reflecting on something you said, Mike, which was this idea of the pressure we put on ourselves, right, to create these really intense projects, these projects that have huge meaning. And I've been thinking a lot during this time that in this world that is so divided, and in some ways where reality just isn't enough, right? We have to HD this thing. We have to that this act of returning back to intimacy and love and relationship, I actually think it's one of the most radical things we can do right now. I think it's some of the best work we need to do in the world, and why sometimes returning to our own vulnerability and returning to our own simplicity of our work might not feel like enough. When we turn it over just a little bit, it's really the most important work I feel like we can be doing. And it reminds me of David Abrams saying that climate crisis, and then he would say, an all human crisis is a crisis of intimacy. That the more work we do from the heart to get reconnected to the world in this truly relational way, not this romantic, gestural, high drama way, but genuine relationship that Brandon's talked about, and how he cultivates love, the kind of love that takes time to create. that's a big thing. Like, that's no small thing. And to just keep reminding ourselves that the act and work of photography is this act of intimacy. And it's a beautiful thing to give an offer to the world. And so I appreciate that about both of you, both Mike and Brandon, the level of heart and care that you put into the work that you do. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Susan. You know, that's the thing about, you know, like the beginning, the work in Mississippi is that, you know, you can all see who I am as a photographer and my background, and it's something that you're always cognizant of. But you know, photography has allowed this sort of this validation of why are you here? Well, I do this, you know, and then the conversation then goes forward to who are you? You know, what are you about? Why is your heart broken, or what have you? And photography has always been about that intimacy, and most importantly, my therapist asked me this a couple of weeks ago. She's like, "What's your stance on vulnerability?" And I was like, "Gosh, you know," and suddenly I'm like talking to her about you know, vulnerability in terms of my marriage, and I, you know, I say this one thing, and then and when I turn around, I'm like, wait, you know, there's a vulnerability every time I walk out the door with my camera, you know.
Yeah.
You know, placing yourself in someone else's hands. And, you know, with that, what I was originally going to say was that, you know, being who I am and knowing you had to understand the history of photography and its uses, and know the pitfalls as much as the triumphs of how it's been used by white practitioners over time, you know, for good and ill, and maintain some sense of cognizance of that, you know, legacy, in hopes of not trotting over that same ground, you know. Yeah, so I think that's something that's always stayed with me was, you know, making sure that there was, like any relationship, transparency and an understanding and a true attempt to form, you know, a bond, you know. Yeah.
Marie, did you want to hop on real quick and ask
yeah,
your
Marie.
question?
Yeah.
Sure. Brandon, thank you for just everything beautiful that you've shared this evening. And thank you for pointing out the selection of Evangeline as a source of your inspiration.
Yes,
and I wondered, has that been something that you've done before? I mean, I know that Mike does this series Between Us, and it always intrigues me how photographers or artists of any sort the interaction between the various arts.
Yes,
is that the first time you selected a poem or piece of literature as the muse or the source of inspiration? And if not, can you explain what else you may have selected and why?
Sure. It is. You know, with the book, the body of work that's in the book, you know, the literature was used as like a supplemental element to further the story or to give more information. You know, in this case with Evangeline, it's Longfellow has such a painterly way of writing. You know, it's so visual, and he can paint a landscape like nobody's business, you know, from describing the silvery tones of the moonlight or what have you. And, you know, so to almost have a foreshadowing of what one might come upon in a region, or to set a mood internally, I think that's what the poem has really been used for. I didn't want to go find that one spot he talked about and try to make this picture of it, but, you know, really just kind of understanding what mood he evokes, you know, and do I find that myself, you know? Yeah. So maybe it won't be a direct translation as much as it'll, you know, be a just a source of inspiration.
Thank you. And your name makes me, was it the Acadian, Louisiana relationship that led to that selection, or does that just happen to seem?
It was. I grew up, as my name suggests, I grew up in the most westerly portion of the Acadian region, and down here in a town called Beaumont, Port Arthur area in southeast Texas. So we're right on the Louisiana line. So in that portion of Texas, you'll find as many Thibodeaux and Boudreaux as you would Smiths and Johnsons. And so going and through the court, I tried to go to Louisiana a couple times early in the 2010s while I was in the heat of really focusing on Mississippi. And I originally had this idea of doing a book of all Thibodeaux, and I'd go to these towns and try to find a Thibodeaux in the phone book, and I'd set up these formal portrait sessions, and they were nice, but it didn't really, stylistically, I was trying to shoot it color because I thought that was going to be more palatable for getting assignment work or whatever. I just complicated the whole process for myself, and it wasn't generating the type of work that I had hoped, the type of work I was making in Mississippi, that is. And so for a long time, I've wanted to go back essentially to the motherland. You go to Southern Louisiana for a Thibodeaux in Texas, that's like going to Mecca, where everybody can pronounce your name correctly. And so yeah, there's been a long desire to return to that area and explore where my grandfather's family is from and my grandmother's family's from. And so in that sense, as much as it is some loose interpretation of this poem or, a wandering through a world, it's in a lot of ways a way for me to reconnect with my grandparents who raised me and who've now passed, and really understanding, instead of trying to understand other people, maybe in some crazy roundabout way, maybe understand a little bit more about myself, and I think that's what photography is good for as well.
Yeah.
Nice. And that's beautiful. The last part of my question is, in another life, I used to write about Cajuns. And so I spent a lot of time down there. And I feel like I saw a statue of Evangeline somewhere.
Yeah.
Do you know, was it in Baton Rouge? Do you know? Or maybe they're all over the place.
It's in there might be a couple. The main, like the Evangeline Oak, is, and the statue are in St. Martinville, which is the southeast of Lafayette, about 20 minutes, I guess 20 minutes.
Okay, that may be where it was.
Yeah, that's like the epicenter for the tale. For those that don't realize, the story, given its Acadian history, was adopted by the southern, French diaspora, the Cajuns, and so you'll find Evangeline Road or Evangeline Oaks all over the place, and I think that's really wonderful.
Yeah. Cool.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. I really appreciate you joining in for this conversation, and then especially on late notice and everything. And
Sure.
This is I've really enjoyed hearing more. This is probably the most in-depth conversation we've ever had about going into these bodies of work, and it's been really great for me as a big fan myself.
Thank you.
So,
I know we've been hard to connect for the past couple months. We've been trying to do this for a while, but I really appreciate you having me again and being persistent.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for joining as well. And Susan put some information on the chat window about some stuff coming up next week. Susan, did you feel like you need to say anything?
Just next week, as some of y'all know, we've been doing a partnership with Revolve and kind of rotating programming, and Dawn Rowe, who's got an amazing new exhibition up at the Tracy Morgan Gallery. There's going to be a conversation with her next week. We won't be facilitating that conversation, but we will be there and enjoying it, and we welcome all of you to sign up through their portal. And then, of course, we'll be back the following weeks as always. And we have a new addition to the 6 Feet Photography Project. Youth at 6 Feet, we're really trying to support educators and young people to use photography as a tool for making sense of this crazy time. And so we've got a team of folks working on curriculum and some other support materials for educators right now. So if you're an educator or you know one, send them to that page on the website. We really appreciate your support. And last but not least, Mike Belleme and Francis and Lydia all curated a fantastic gallery that's up on both the Click Photography Festival website and our website. And if you haven't had a chance to see that, it's just a beautiful sample of just a tiny bit of the work. And don't forget that on Instagram, any photographs taken during the pandemic, please use the hashtag Life at 6 feet. We're up to about 4,500, 4,600 stunning images. And if you haven't had a chance to look through that archive recently, it's really touching, moving collection of images. And we encourage you to go there and enjoy that. And as always, we're so grateful that you're a part of this community and for showing up and for sharing your precious time with us. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Awesome.
Good night, everybody.
All right. Have a great evening. Thank you all.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Brandon.
it. All right. Bye-bye.